Again? Who keeps leaving things at my doorstep? I muttered as I opened my front door, only to find a small, unmarked box sitting neatly on the wooden porch. A gust of Texas wind rattled the wind chimes, and my old cat, Whiskey, flicked his tail in mild annoyance from his perch by the window. This was the third time in the past 2 months that something had mysteriously appeared outside my house. First, it was a jar of homemade peach jam. Then a book, The Old Man and the Sea, ironically appropriate, though I wasn't sure whether to feel amused or insulted. And now this. I bent down, eyeing the box with suspicion. Scrawled across the top in untidy handwriting were the words, "A gift for a kind soul." I snorted. "Kind soul? Buddy, you got the wrong house." Whiskey let out a low, unimpressed meow, clearly uninterested in my musings. I gave the box a nudge with my foot. It didn't explode. So far, so good. You see, I don't like surprises. Haven't liked them since my wife passed 15 years ago. I keep my life simple, same breakfast every morning, same newspaper, same afternoon nap. The only company I keep is my cat, and occasionally my nosy neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who insists on bringing me her god-awful casserole every Thanksgiving. I sighed and picked up the box. If it was another useless trinket, I'd just toss it in the closet with the others. Taking it inside, I set it on the kitchen counter and grabbed my old pocket knife. The blade sliced through the tape effortlessly, and with a flick of my wrist, the flaps popped open. Inside, folded neatly, was a knitted sweater, worn but carefully kept. Beneath it, a letter and a small, faded photograph rested atop the fabric. I hesitated. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a bakery promotion. This was something else. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked up the letter and unfolded it. The paper was soft with age, the ink slightly smudged. "Dear sir, you may not remember me, but many years ago, you changed my life with a simple act of kindness. I never got the chance to thank you properly. This sweater belonged to someone who meant the world to me, and now, I want you to have it. Consider it a small token of gratitude, from someone who never forgot what you did for them." There was no signature, no name, just those words. I frowned, my chest tightening with something I couldn't quite place. Slowly, I picked up the photograph. It was grainy black and white. A thin, barefoot boy, no older than 10, standing outside what looked like an old diner. His clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt, but it was his eyes that caught me, haunted, hungry, uncertain. Something stirred in the back of my mind. A memory I had buried so deep, I almost didn't recognize it. I sank into my chair, gripping the photo. Who was this boy? And why did I feel like I knew him? Memories are strange things. They don't always come when you call them. Sometimes they stay buried for decades, only to surface when you least expect them, like a wave crashing against a shore long thought forgotten. I turned the photograph over. Faint pencil scribbles ran across the back. Winter, 1974. And suddenly, like a door unlocking, it all came flooding back. A bitter cold night. My old diner, the one I used to own before I retired. The smell of coffee and fried eggs lingering in the air. And outside, shivering in the frost-covered street, stood a boy. He was so small, too thin. His arms wrapped tightly around himself as he stared through the fogged-up window, watching the warm light inside like it was a world he didn't belong to. I had almost ignored him, almost flipped the sign to closed and gone about my night. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he stood, not begging, not moving, just hoping. I pushed open the door. "You hungry, kid?" His head snapped up, eyes wide with uncertainty. For a moment, he didn't move, like he didn't believe I was talking to him. "Come on, before you freeze to death out there," I grumbled, stepping aside. Slowly, hesitantly, he shuffled forward. His bare feet made no sound on the worn tile floor. I didn't ask questions, didn't pry, just led him to the nearest booth and poured him a cup of steaming hot cocoa. He cupped it with both hands, fingers trembling. "You allergic to anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "Good," I muttered, heading to the kitchen. A few minutes later, I placed a plate in front of him. Hot pancakes, thick-cut bacon, scrambled eggs. A simple meal, but to him, it might as well have been a feast. He didn't say a word. Just ate, quick but careful, like he wasn't sure when his next meal would come. I leaned against the counter watching. When he finished, I walked to the back and rummaged through the lost and found box. Pulled out an old navy blue sweater my son had outgrown. "Here," I said, tossing it to him. "Cold nights are meaner than folks." His tiny hands clutched the sweater. His eyes, God, those eyes looked up at me with something raw. Gratitude. Disbelief. And then, without a word, he ran. I never saw him again. Until now. I exhaled shakily, gripping the photo, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. The sweater in the box, it was the same one I had given him all those years ago. The fabric was faded, worn from time, but there was no mistaking it. He had kept it, and now, after decades, he had sent it back to me. But why? Who was he now? And how had he found me after all these years? I didn't have the answers. But something told me I was about to find out. I didn't sleep that night. The sweater sat on my kitchen table like a relic from the past, and every time I looked at it, a storm of memories and questions swirled in my mind. Who was this boy now? Why had he sent it back to me after all these years? And most importantly, how had he found me? By sunrise, I had made up my mind. I poured myself a cup of coffee, grabbed the letter and the photograph, and settled down in front of my old laptop, the one my daughter had practically shoved into my hands years ago, insisting I get with the times. I wasn't good with technology. Heck, I still preferred my landline over a cell phone. But desperate times called for desperate measures. I opened the search engine and typed in, "Man helps homeless boy in Texas diner, 1974. No results. I sighed. Of course there wouldn't be. It wasn't like my small act of kindness had made the evening news. I tapped my fingers on the desk thinking. Then a different idea hit me. I typed, "Successful businessman returns to help hometown." It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. The screen loaded, and within seconds an article popped up, "From Homeless to CEO, the inspiring story of James Caldwell." My breath caught. I clicked the link, and there he was. The same eyes. Older now, framed by laugh lines and success, but unmistakably the same boy from that cold winter night. James Caldwell. The article told the whole story. He had been abandoned as a child. Lived on the streets, scrounging for food. Spent years in and out of shelters. And then one day someone had shown him kindness, given him a meal, a sweater, a chance to feel human again. He never forgot it. That night, he vowed to turn his life around. Now, decades later, he was one of the most successful restaurant owners in the state, running a chain of high-end diners, giving jobs to struggling youth, and funding programs to help the homeless. My stomach twisted. I had given that kid a plate of pancakes and an old sweater. To me, it had been nothing. But to him, it had been everything. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my face with both hands. The weight of it all pressed against my chest. And then, right on cue, my doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer. Almost let it ring and ring, convincing myself I wasn't ready. But something deep inside told me I needed to open that door. So I did. And standing there on my porch was James Caldwell. I blinked. "Well, I'll be damned." He smiled. "Mr. Henderson?" I hadn't heard my own name spoken with that much warmth in a long, long time. You found me," I muttered, feeling my throat tighten. He chuckled. "Took me a while. But I had to. I couldn't just send the box and leave it at that." I gestured toward the house. "Well, don't just stand there looking all fancy. Come in before the neighbors think I've suddenly become important." He laughed, a full, hearty laugh, and stepped inside. For a few moments, we just stood there, studying each other. Time had changed both of us. I was older, slower, a little grumpier. He was polished, successful, a man who had built something out of nothing. But underneath it all, I could still see the boy. "I never got to say thank you," he finally said, his voice quieter now. I waved him off. "It was just a meal." He shook his head. "No, sir." It was hope. The words hung between us. Then, as if sensing things were getting too sentimental, whiskey jumped onto the table, knocking over a cup of coffee in the process. James laughed. Still got a troublemaker, huh? I snorted. Yeah, well, some things don't change. And just like that, the tension broke. We sat down. Talked. About that night. About his life. About everything in between. And then, before he left, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. A key. I frowned. What's this? He smiled. The address is on the tag. It's yours if you want it. I flipped the tag over. It was the location of one of his restaurants. I don't understand, I said. James met my gaze. I want you to come work with me. Help train the next generation. Give them what you gave me. I stared at him. You offer me a job? A job, a purpose, whatever you want to call it, he said. You once gave me a chance when no one else did. Now, I'm just returning the favor. I didn't say yes. Not at first. I spent a week pacing my house, arguing with myself, convincing myself I was too old, too stubborn, too set in my ways to start something new. But every time I passed the kitchen table, my eyes landed on two things, the key and the sweater. And finally, one morning, I put on my best shirt, which wasn't saying much, and drove to the address on the tag. The restaurant was beautiful, modern yet warm. James was already waiting for me at the door. You actually came, he said, grinning. I huffed. Don't make a big deal out of it. He led me inside, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. I started slow, just watching, observing. But soon enough, I was in the kitchen teaching, just like I had done with my old employees years ago. And you know what? I loved it. The young workers looked at me like I was some kind of wise old chef, hanging on to my every word. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel useless. I felt alive. Weeks turned into months. James and I grew close like family. He would drop by my place, bring me books, even take whiskey to the vet when needed. And one day, while sitting in my office at the restaurant, I looked at him and said, you know, if I had known giving away a sweater would land me a fancy job years later, I would have started handing out clothes like a charity. James burst out laughing. Well, next time, maybe you'll think twice before calling it just a meal. I smiled. Yeah, maybe. Because now I finally understood. A single act of kindness had started all of this. One meal. One sweater. And now here we were, two men from two different worlds, bound together by a moment of compassion neither of us had forgotten. And as I sat there, watching James joke with the staff, I realized something. Life wasn't just about what we give. It was about what comes back to us when we least expect it. And for the first time in years, I felt grateful. Truly, deeply grateful.